Welcome to our continued coverage on the 51st session of the Economic Commission for Africa, of course discussing what the outlook for the continent is, both mid to long term, and what issues need to be addressed before that. Now, coming up on the show today, we have three particular issues. One, we discuss jobs and social protection. We discuss data and regional integration, how those conversations have shifted over the last couple of years, and a crucial conversation on reduction of dependence on export commodities. Let's kick things off with the latter. Antonio Pedro, handling Central Africa, gives us his breakdown on what we need to prioritize.
The work of the International Resources Panel suggests that what we call resource intensity will continue to increase up to 2050 because there are many developing countries that still need minerals for their cities, for their roads, and this is resource intensity. However, excessive dependence on the export of these minerals will always create macroeconomic instability because commodity prices will go up and down. There are certain new minerals, what we call the boutique minerals, the battery minerals. These I'm talking about things like graphite, lithium, cobalt, which are important for the electrification of our lifestyles, about reducing carbon dependence. Those ones will certainly increase as more electric vehicles will be on the road. However, there are certain other minerals, like, for example, coal and possibly iron ore, which will have a sort of a downward trend in terms of prices. We should now talk about an inward utilization of these resources by promoting more value addition locally to meet our own needs of steel, our own needs of all sorts of minerals and products. The second is diversifying away from that dependence, utilizing some of the revenue streams towards creating opportunities in other sectors of the economy, linking the extractive sector with other sectors of the economy, having services, providing goods and services and inputs towards the extractive sector. Because the extractive sector, in terms of the cost profile, you're talking about 60% of the costs are procurement of goods and services. In Central Africa, because of that excessive dependence on extractives, we are articulating a program on economic diversification policies and reforms, which is centered on the need to ensure that economies utilize their resources rents well, but also promotes other growth potentials.
That bit on renegotiating the contracts has been a tasky one because it involves a lot of bureaucracy. So the time spent to try and change something that was embedded into this economic or macro policies is something of a bit of an issue.
Well, on contracts, of course, renegotiating contracts every time or changing laws every time does create instability because what investors want are predictability. So one aspect of our position about this is, as much as possible, avoid contract negotiations. Try and regulate it. Try and include most of the provisions in terms of the fiscal regimes and so on into your overall policy tools that are applicable to any sector. So that's one part of it. Regulate and reduce the extent of negotiation. But there are, of course, sometimes needs for negotiation. And those needs need to be addressed in a holistic manner. First, understanding what are the contradictions within the existing policies, laws, and regulations. For example, many countries want to pursue local content with their minerals in their mineral sector, but at the same time they've signed bilateral investment treaties that do not allow you to have this how do you call it, differentiated treatment to investments. If you and I are country A and country B, and we've signed a bilateral investment treaty, it means that you are going to give me the same treatment that you are doing to your domestic investors. Local content is the opposite. So you need to reconcile those aspects in terms of policy coherence.
Jobs, jobs, and more jobs. That has been one of the underlying expected outcomes of the continental free trade area. But do we understand what elements of employment and social protection need to be addressed first? Take a look.
What we are looking at from the employment perspective is that if people move, and in fact there should be a free movement of labor, and which is the bedrock of international migration, because people move in search of employment, better employment opportunities. So I think what we are saying is that when people move looking for employment opportunities, are their skills and are their qualifications recognized across borders? And so therefore that very important element which may determine whether the people who move will be able to pick up similar jobs in a different context.
So when you move from one area to another, one of the largest issues is harmonization of either the labor laws or the pay grade, the scale of things. So what have you discussed around that topic?
Well, a lot of things need to be developed much more carefully, and we looked at much more carefully as part of the CFTA. But I'm going to talk more about the employment part, of the jobs part. And so yes, there needs to be a certain degree of harmonization. There is linguistic harmonization. So that is the reason why we find that migration in Africa takes place mostly within the same sub-region. So people in West Africa move within West Africa, people in East Africa and Southern Africa move within those sub-regions. So partly because of linguistic and cultural harmonization. But in terms of jobs, and that is very important, so that you get similar kind of jobs, the skills that you have, you should be able to carry those skills, and those skills should be recognized. Unfortunately, what the situation in Africa is that there is a very high level of informality. So most people are working in the informal sector, and the informal sector doesn't usually recognize jobs because it is giving job opportunities for people even without skills, or the skills that you might have picked up while working. So you might have the skills, but you may not have a certificate or a degree or a piece of paper to prove that you have those skills. And so therefore this question of balancing the skills, the availability of skills, with a kind of a degree or a qualification certificate, which would help them get the jobs across in different countries, is an important element of our work, and that is what we are focusing on.
All right, now, a weak data and lack of data depth have been highlighted as some of the hindrances to growth. Before policies are formulated, these have to be addressed more deliberately. Let's hear this from two voices, one handling it from a macroeconomic point of view and the other within the Trade Policy Division of the Commission.
We know that many African countries are collecting data at national level. So to start with, we need to cooperate at regional level and among ourselves, international organizations including African Union, ECA, ADB, that work on data in Africa with countries, so that we can have a stronger and better database that we can share among ourselves. Currently, most of us are using poverty data and poverty estimates made by World Bank. Most of them date back to 2013, and I think this is unacceptable for us in Africa. More needs to be done to update our data.
We published a report last year, indeed, that looked at what has changed between 2016 and 2017, and we enumerated a number of these projects, especially on infrastructure. When it comes to manufacturing, certainly, manufacturing adding value to products. Also adding value to services, that kind of approach is, clearly what African countries should be aiming at. And all African countries have strong potential in adding value to goods, to services, to resources that they already produce. So I think you should not look at manufacturing in very narrow terms, but as part of adding value, as part of being part of regional and global value chains as well. Certainly countries that are already quite advanced in this process will do better. But that does not mean that it's mutually exclusive, that other countries cannot find their own strategies also to be able to benefit from value addition.
In regards to what we were just touching on at the top before we got into the interview, the 5 billion deficit, of course, on aggregate, a collective approach towards handling that on the continent? The very broad estimates, because these figures, we must be a bit cautious here. These figures vary, from source to source. But yes, very broadly, the estimates that
there could be revenue loss from lower tariffs of in the region of about 4 to 5 billion. This is in aggregate, the whole continent. But against that, there are projections that the gains from increased economic activity, from new sources of taxation, from the new sources of investment and so on, that these would more than make up for the revenue losses. Actually, the projections are that the gains could be anything from $15 to $30 billion as against $4 to $5 billion. But again, we all need to be cautious about these figures. We need to understand what methodology is behind them and so on.
Right. One last question. What is your view on preferential market schemes? We were thinking by the time we reach this point in 2018, we'd have a lot more positivity on that.
Well, what the African Continental Free Trade Area is aiming to do is to create a preferential market among the African countries. And we expect this to enter into force as soon as 22 countries have ratified. So, I mean, basically what that means is that African countries will be saying that when we trade among ourselves, we want to give each other greater access than when we trade with third parties. And, this is a normal, it's a usual kind of practice that neighbors have among themselves. So basically, that's what the Free Trade Area Agreement is trying to do.
That concludes today's coverage of the 51st session of the Economic Commission for Africa, tackling three crucial issues: employment and social protection, reducing dependence on export commodities, and of course, regional integration and a data point of view. Remember, this continues over the next couple of days. My name is George Ndirango. Keep it right here on CNBC Africa, first in business worldwide.